Hello, welcome to Convergent Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am very happy to bring the conversation I had with Agustín Fuentes. Agustín is an anthropologist and professor of anthropology at Princeton University. His research focuses on the entanglement of biological systems with social and cultural lives of humans, our ancestors, and other animals with whom humanity shares close relations. He has a bachelor's in anthropology and zoology, and he also has a master's and PhD in anthropology from UC Berkeley. And his current projects include exploring cooperation, creativity, and belief in human evolution, evolutionary theory and processes, and many other topics. He is the author of numerous books, including the most recent, Sex is a Spectrum, The Biological Limits of the Binary, and that's what we talk about in this conversation. We talk about the history of sex evolution, the importance of gametes, intersex individuals, and history of the sex binary. Talk about gonads and hormones, sex variation in the animal kingdom, this spectrum question, gender in sports, gender in bathrooms, and many other topics. Of course, this is a topic that people continue to talk about in society and culture at large. I think what's important, I'm sure people will disagree with him or with me, and that's fine. I guess, and which is, my role in these conversations that can sometimes be tense is really not to lose the humanity of people, right? I know that's his project, that's my project. There's some things that people can debate or some, tricky stuff, but at the end of the day, we can't forget the humanity of people that are trying to understand themselves accurately, as we all are. And to me, that's where the conversation starts and ends, is we focus on humanity, we talk about good science, and we try to see and understand things about many people around us and understanding this idea of biological sex and gender. So I think that's my central focus here. That's his central focus. And so hopefully a lot of the conversation there can have a lot of good discussion and debate with people. But my hope is that the humanity of people impacted by some of these debates doesn't get lost. As always, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com. I'm also on YouTube. So please subscribe. Really, really helps. And share with your friends. And now I bring you Agustín Fuentes. I am here with Agustín Fuentes. Agustín, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'm looking forward to talking to you.
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to it too.
Yeah, so we'll talk all about your new book, which is Sex is a Spectrum, The Biological Limits of the Binary. And as we were talking before we started, it's a small book with lots of information, but it's very digestible. It's very, very good. And I really, really liked the way you engaged with this topic and the tone and all of it. So it's wonderful. So we'll talk all about it. And before we do, tell listeners kind of who you are professionally, academically, and anything else that's relevant about you.
Yeah, so as you heard, my name is Agustín Fuentes. I'm an anthropologist. I'm a particular kind of anthropologist. Most people don't know what anthropology is. I'm a biological anthropologist, so my degrees, right, my training is in zoology, right, the study of all sort of animal life, and anthropology, the study of everything human, sort of mixed together. I've worked on people, monkeys, apes, dusky-footed wood rats, seagulls. I've worked across a number of different kinds of species, and I'm really interested in, what are the interfaces between bodies, biology, culture, evolutionary histories, societies, lives, things like that. So I'm really interested in sort of the big picture and the small bits that make us who we are.
That's I would imagine doing anthropology, especially in that way, you're kind of I can imagine you're at different points. You're zooming in and zooming out, right? Right. Right. The long history of us as humans, and then the very, very biological bits. So that's wonderful. Okay, so I was telling you before we started as well. I've read a few of your other books, which are great. I I guess what drove you or motivated you to write this book on a topic that's it receives more and more attention in the past 5 to 10 years? Yeah, what caused you to write on this?
I mean, I think what happens is, and I think probably anyone who's listening to this has had the experience, people really care about, are interested in, and are slightly ignorant of the entire range of being human as it relates to sex and gender. And I think, when I say ignorant, I don't mean that in a negative way. I'm just saying there's so much information, there's so much research and science. Most people don't know that. So we only hear what people are yelling or what we experience in our own lives. And so my point with this book is like, hey, there's this huge amount of biological literature and anthropological, sociological, psychological, and historical knowledge. Let's summarize some of that, provide some good nuggets of info so that we can have a better conversation. Because you can't listen to just social media or people yelling. That's not going anywhere. What you need to listen to is yourself and your own lived experience with other human beings and access to the data. And I figured we can have a better conversation. Why don't I try the best I can, drawing on the last 30 years of my research and lived experience to facilitate that?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think one of the things that I think, it's what I try to do here, and it sounds like what you try to do as well, is you have to have good conversations. You have to have good dialogue, sometimes about topics that people have strong opinions about. But I always think if someone has a strong opinion about it, it must be tethered to something for them, personally. People don't just have strong opinions, right? You have strong opinions if you have something connected to it with, whatever your belief system is or an experience or, whatever. And so, I think the ultimate thing is, these things matter, right? I think they matter in a lot of ways. But my aim, I've said this before, is, I don't ever want to forsake, the human or people that are involved in it, right? People with experiences, emotions, different types of feelings. And so my respect is always for the human. So some of this stuff is hard. Some of this stuff is tricky. Some of the stuff is, kind of updating old code. But, I think it's, the conversations should be had. So I think that's your contribution is with the book is already very valuable in a lot of ways. So this is great.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that. Let me just add to that as well, that this conversation, we spend too much time talking about very, very small groups of people, very specific things. We forget that this is actually a conversation about all of us, right? Sex and gender are about all living humans and our history and our experience and our bodies and our lives. And so I think we need to be really careful. Well, this will come up in our conversation, not to just talk about one specific part of this incredible range of biological and cultural variation that is the human being. And to really remember it's about all of us, and we're all part of this.
Yeah, I totally agree with you there. So, okay, so the big thing here is, the book is, kind of just from the title and the subtitle here is, many people, myself included, I'm sure for you as well, kind of grew up or we learned in, high school or whatever, kind of, undergrad biology class that, when people think about our species, we think of, two sexes, right? Two biological sexes. We think of, male, female. And you're saying, maybe not so much. Maybe sex, biological sex, we can see as more of a spectrum. Now, when I think of a spectrum, I think of literally, a line that's drawn and there's, like more or less, a one endpoint, sort of thing. But a spectrum is something there, and then there's like, hash marks or tick marks all along that spectrum. That's how I see it in my head. So instead of discrete categories, we're looking at more continuous ones, I guess. So how do you understand, or how do you try to, kind of the thesis statement, I guess, if you will, of how, biological sex is a spectrum instead of just the binary that we've kind of been used to?
So 2 points in my answer, and then we can talk about this. The first one is I want to make absolutely clear. Males and females, men and women are not the same thing. They're not the same. Reproductive biology, right? The biology associated reproduction in our bodies and all bodies matters a lot. And for humans, it shapes our bodies and our structures and lives in particularly important ways, right? Those two things are true. There can't be any debate about that.
Right.
However, the spectrum thing, and this is the second part, a spectrum is not a line with the little hash marks.
Okay.
A spectrum is a swarm of developmental processes, right? It's a spread of stuff.
Okay.
And different aspects of it are more clustered in different areas. So we got to get away from the line and the graph and to think about a 4-dimensional like cluster or sphere with like fluid, like certain things are more over here, certain things are more over there. You can identify clusters in this spectrum, but nothing is distinctly different in the sense that it's two kinds. So here's the answer to your question. Males and females are not two different kinds of human. They're variations on the same thing, right? We're all humans, Homo sapiens, right? Genus Homo, species sapiens. But there's patterned and structured variation in our species that translates, right, into patterned bodies and variations in bodies and different kinds of things that overlap in many things and don't so much in other things. And understanding that distribution of variation biologically and culturally in humans gives us a better insight. And so while certain things are binary like, or in binaries, we'll talk about this, like gametes, like sperm and egg, there's two types, right? One is very different from the other. But there's almost nothing in the human body that is that distinct aside from those two things. And yes, sperm is not a man and an egg is not a woman. And so we need to think biologically. And this is one of the things that comes from my training as a zoologist, right? In addition to an anthropologist, I'm really interested in whole bodies and whole bodies in interactions with other bodies and their ecology or environment, right? The big picture, like how do things actually live? And that was a long ramble. I will try not to ramble so much, but I think this is really important. By saying sex is a spectrum, I'm not saying there's no differences.
Okay.
I am saying that it's not good to talk about sex as a binary exclusively because that makes it almost impossible to do good biological and cultural research.
Yeah. Okay. So it's there. The spectrum is not my antiquated tick marks with the line. You're saying more of like a sort of a spherical thing where you can have certain attributes or certain things in certain kinds of categories.
Different poles or different parts of it, or some stuff is closer to the equator, other stuff's near the poles, and it's all mixed around. And there's not like just two kinds. It's one species with some really interesting variation. And as we'll talk about later, some species, not humans, but some species have multiple variations on this same sex biology, not just 2 or 3 or 4.
I guess we'll probably mention it at some point with the history here, but when we're thinking about, there's a lot of parts to this, I guess. So we have bodies, and we have bodies. Evolution gives us at a baseline some functionality of things. That's not obviously all we are. We're not just functional things, of course. But I think when we're trying to make delineations, or kind of in the truest sense of the word, discriminations between one thing is like this and one thing is not like this, is it, if we're seeing sex in a spectrum or these kind of poles or things like that, I mean, I might be answering my own question, but doesn't that make it more complicated? Like it makes it makes it more like confusing, no?
So it does. It does when you're asking, but it also makes it more scientifically rigorous and informational, right? And so that's the problem. And this is to say sex is spectrum is not to say, oh, well, I can't tell. Am I a male or a female? I know, right? We in our lives and we meet, but there isn't a discrete category that is male and a discrete category that is female in 100% of us. That is, a lot of humans don't fit whatever definition we want of male and female. But more importantly, most things about us don't map that way. So, for example, if I was to plop a liver on the desk in front of me here, and I'd be like, is this male or female? You would be, I have no idea. And to tell you the truth, livers are not sexed in that way. Now, livers change in our bodies over our lives, depending on how we live our lives and who we are. But so many things like hearts aren't sexed, kidneys. Some people made some arguments about nephrons, but my point here is that skin, right? Even bones, right? We're all made of the same stuff. And so understanding how that same stuff produces pattern variations and what the relation of those variations are biologically is really important. We want to know, how does biology work in humans? And just saying, well, there's males and there's females and they're totally different doesn't help.
Let me ask this way. I might be jumping ahead here, but so you wouldn't say that I'm getting a much clearer sense of the argument you're making here, which makes sense, which is if we sort of abandon the discrete categories of the binary, we see a kind of, a lot of, fluidity, a lot of variation here. Most people would say the majority of humans fall into male, female, and you can know that by, various cultural kind of artifacts, how people dress, how they appear, what they wear.
I'm gonna cut you off right there. And this is actually really important because you're just describing gender.
Yes, right.
So, and I'm talking about biology, and what we got to do is realize that every single human is what we call gender sexed. That is, we have bodies, but those bodies never exist without the cultural sort of those kinds of contexts, right? And so what I'm trying to do is say, what do we know about biology? What do we know about the culture stuff? Now we can actually recognize that they're always mixed together. And that's where the spectrum and the complexity comes in.
Okay. Yeah. Totally. I'm totally with you on that. I totally agree there. So I guess you would resist, or I don't want to say resist, but you would at the very least say this idea that the majority of people fall into male, female biologically, you would not agree with that, or you would?
No. Depending on which definition you're using, that's a problem. And I go over this in the book. There's actually lots of definitions. So I like to use something called the 3G definition, because that's really what we're talking about. That is, there are typical patterns for humans. There are two reasonably typical patterns, right? Of genes, a certain set of genes, gonads, right? Ovaries or testes, and genitals. So there's a set of genes, gonads, and genitals that go together, right? Actually, chromosomes, right? As certain genes. In males, and we use those to identify males and females. The vast majority of humans fall into that. But almost all of those things, gonads, genes, genitals, actually aren't binary. They're not like 1-0, totally this or totally that. They're from the same stuff and they're modified. So even in that case, the binary doesn't help. But yes, and this is what you point out is really important. There is not much debate when you walk around in your life identifying males and females, right? Now, let me point out that there is a percentage, right? Tens of millions of people who are intersex who neither fall not into male or female by almost any definition. That's, just keep that in mind. But that doesn't mean in any way, shape, or form that there aren't males and females. There are. And they're different in some important ways, but it's not a binary. These are not two different kinds of things. And so if we're really interested in what's going on, let's talk about the biology. Let's talk about the patterns. And what we see is this variation that's on a spectrum, not two distinct clumps.
Okay. Yeah. That's helpful. So let's talk about, we'll talk a little bit about some of the history here, which this is where I'm assuming that your anthropology hat comes into play here, which is very nice. It's very nice. Is you talk about way back in the beginning, there was no sex. And then we have it, right? I mean, 2 million years later, we get to these different types of, kinds of organisms, which include animals and plants. And then you start to get the function and role of sex and how the genetic material into next generation, et cetera. What's that kind of brief overview of that story?
So this is billions of years of human evolution in like a minute or two. But I think this is really important because when we talk about sex, everyone forgets we're talking about this biological process that evolved, right? Before the evolution of sexual reproduction, right, which is two different organisms getting together, sharing material to produce offspring. Organisms were single-celled or a few cells, and what they would do is just like divide. They would just copy themselves and divide. It's called asexual reproduction, and still a lot of things on the planet do that. It turns out that if you're just asexually reproducing, if there's a lot of variation, say in climate or temperature or whatever, you're living in a pond and you're some amoeba-like thing, and like the opportunities for changing radically in response to changing environments are limited, right? If you're just making copies of yourself. However, if there are two things in the same species that are very similar to one another, but slightly different, they can get together and produce an offspring, a cell, right? That is a little bit of a mix of those two. And maybe, just maybe, that offspring, that new mix, has a little bit more flexibility to respond to environmental challenges. That is the whole hypothesis for why sex evolved, right? We don't know exactly why it evolved, but that's a good model. And what we see, over a billion years ago is that this shows up and starts to show up in different types of organisms. And then it sort of takes off and runs with it because variation is good in an evolutionary sense overall. And over time, we see sexual reproduction become a dominant force across most animals and plants.
Yeah. So once we have this, we start to see this in unicellular and then multicellular organisms. One of the things that kind of comes here into the picture, which is important, which for many people they will lean heavily on this fact to make the binary, is gametes.
There we go.
Right. This is, gametes start to become important for sexual reproduction. And so you have the anisogamy, which is two gametes, the ova and the sperm. Maybe just park here for a minute and say, you can explain what that is, but how we can still have large gametes, small gametes, but still have that within the spectrum that you're discussing.
Yeah. Absolutely. So this is really critical. And this is why in the book, when I was first pitching it to people, like, why are we talking about a couple billion years ago in the evolution of sex? You're talking about people. Because if we're really going to talk about sex, we got to know the big picture. What is sex? What is, as a biological thing, what is it? So today, right, most sexually reproducing organisms, so let's just stick with animals because plants are crazy and really amazing, but much more complicated. Sexually reproducing animals, most have anisogamy, right, which means that two gametes are produced. And gametes are what we call sex cells, right? We say sperm, and it's actually sperm and ova, but we say egg all the time, which is confusing in the book because I talk about eggs, which are actually it's a complex thing, and then eggs, which are ova. Anyway, so let's just say sperm and egg for right now. Yeah. But what's really, I think, important to point out is that I said sex is two slightly different organisms of the same species producing these gametes to get together, to fuse into a new organism, right, into the offspring. So the gametes themselves in most animals now are different in the sense that one gamete is very large. It's what we call the ova or the egg. That has sort of 50% of all the DNA, one full copy of the DNA, plus a bunch of the enzymes and all the cell machinery. It's the whole set cell. And then there's the sperm, which is really, really small, that has the DNA and then some other proteins and a few other things. And when those two fuse, right, you get two sets of chromosomes, two full sets of DNA that come together and mix it up. That's how you get the variation, right? And then they begin developing from one cell into two cells, into four cells, into 8 cells, whatever, start splitting. Now, this is really important, this system, because traditionally it was thought the big gamete, the egg, right, with all the stuff, actually is expensive to produce because it has all the stuff, right? It takes more than the little teeny cell, the sperm, right? And so most people used to think, well, that tells us everything. Big egg, very costly, very important. That's going to make bodies do one thing. Those bodies that produce sperm, it's teeny, it's cheap, they're going to do other things. However, that's not actually the right comparison, because like for humans, for example, one ova, right, one egg, needs about 15 million sperm per ejaculate to have a chance of fusion.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I know per ejaculate, it will have millions of sperm and most of it get wasted. And then there's the one that gets there and all that.
But that's what I'm saying. You need that many just to make it happen. So if you have like 4 to 5 million sperm, that's too little. Like you're not going to, that's almost infertile. So really those numbers are different. Plus all of the ova are produced in humans and in most mammals right around or before birth, but sperm production goes on the whole time. And there's all this anyway, we could go into much more detail, but we want to get onto some of the other stuff. The bottom line here is that some people argue that because there's a difference in size and sort of overall biological costs for one ova and one sperm, that those tell you everything you need to know about the different trajectory of male and female. Females are those with ova, males are those with sperm. I and many, many, many other scientists, biologists, developmental scientists, endocrinologists, and other folks would argue that that is an insufficient explanation of what it means to be a male or a female. Because even though even though gametes are binary, an ova and a sperm, two distinct kinds, they're different, right? They are produced by physiological systems that are not binary, right? That overlap a lot and are developed from the same stuff. And they are in bodies that most of the traits of the bodies are also not binary, right? They're overlapping and they're actually the same in many places. So the whole point here is if you want to say all sex are gametes, then you can say it's binary. But what does it tell you? Like if I said to you, or said to me, like, I can produce sperm. That's it. You don't need to know anything else about me because that's it. Biologically, there's nothing else. That's a lie. That's not accurate and it's not good science.
it's a important, I think, context there. So let me make sure I'm clear, because some people have tried to say, well, a person's reproductive system and their genitals, that's what makes them male and female, right? And then other people say, no, that's not quite right. It's the chromosomes, right? It's the chromosomes.
Right.
You know, there's this one, and there's XY, XX. No, that's not quite right either. That's not what makes you female, male. And so then now, where I think many people have kind of, landed on is, well, it's the gametes. There's always big gamete, small gamete, and that's it. There's only two.
Right.
Hence, that's the male, female.
So
go ahead.
Sure, but I'm sorry to interrupt, but what does that get you? If you want to define, and it's like people do, it's like, that's the definition, that's it. I'm like, well, as a biologist, right, I do work in biology, right? I work with humans and other animals, a lot of primates. It does me very little good to go out and only measure gametes from an individual. I actually need to know a lot more information. And it turns out all of that other information does not map to a binary. So that's the challenge, right? And you're right. Everyone's like, it's genitals. No, actually, genitals don't help you map stuff out into two categories. Even reproductive tracts and like gonads, right? Ovaries and testes, they actually don't do it all the time either, because they don't always come in a binary format. The bottom line is, if you want to say, no, males are sperm and females are egg, period, that's it, I'm not going to discuss this anymore, that's fine. That's not going to help you do things about health, not going to tell you much about sports. It's not going to tell you much about math ability, interest in, military or fighting or whatever. So we can talk more about this, but I think that's a really important point.
Yeah. I guess I'm totally with you. I think that obviously a person is not just their large or small gametes, of course. So that makes intuitive sense. I guess the only thing I have, a question I have is that you couldn't, you can tell me, you couldn't have it the opposite way. Right? Where for me, right? I identify as a male. I don't have a large gamete. I don't have ova. I don't produce that. Right?
Right. Yes.
And so, of course, that's, again, I'm not only defined by my gametes.
Right.
But in terms of biological sex, is that, I don't want to put a value on it, right? As most important or things like that. But that's instructive, though, in terms of making difference. Yes?
Sure, absolutely. It's because the gamete stuff is really important. Gametogenesis is important, but then you have to say, if those things are different, right? If that's the definition, first of all, then what do we do with intersex individuals in humans and other species, and in other species where they switch those reproductive systems in the body? The bottom line is, you can say, well, I have sperm, I don't have gametes. That's a definitional component, but what does that tell you? I'm really interested in how things work, right? And what functions. And so, for example, and let's just drop this right here, the current administration's definition of sex, right, says, boom, this is it, sperm or egg. Nothing else matters. And biologically, that's problematic and incorrect. So we have to ask, as an organism, as a species, what are the patterns of biological variation that are really relevant to day-to-day life, to health, to nutrition and diet, to cognitive functioning? None of those things are binary. And so what does it help you to say, well, I don't have large gametes? Right. It's important. It actually does tell you something, right? But I think what most people want to say is, and there's a whole history in evolutionary biology of theorizing, and these are hypotheses, that if you make a small gamete, this tells me all of this about you. And if you make a large gamete, this tells me all this about you. But if you look at the last 20 years or so of research, it's becoming more and more evident that those blanket statements don't hold. For many species, including humans.
There's two things I want to come to, but I guess before that, I'm curious. It might be a little bit in the weeds, but I think it's important here, and I'm sure we'll come back to it as well. So you mentioned intersex individuals. So is that a situation, and maybe it's just different, it's not, again, a kind of universal, but if someone is intersex, so they're not traditionally male or female biologically in the way we've kind of traditionally known it, does that mean that they have both of the gametes, or they have one of the other? How does that work?
So this is people misrepresent this discussion all the time. That's why I talk about biological variation in humans, because people are like, well, there's male and female and intersex, as if there's three distinctive things. It turns out almost everything we're talking about in bodies doesn't fall into two distinct categories, right? Now the gametes do, right? So the gametes, but not even the gonads, either testes or ovaries, that are critical in the production of gametes. Those things don't always fall in a binary. You can have both in one body. You can even have something, a gonad developed called an ovotestes, that has both ovary and testes tissue in it. Now, that's not common at all, right? Sure. It's very rare, but it does happen. And the reason it happens is we are not a binary. The human species doesn't come in two types, right? We come in one type with patterns of variation. And so understanding that variation is really important. So when we talk about intersex individuals in humans, we're talking about individuals that don't quite fit that 3G pattern, right? That is, they might have one set of genes that we think is associated with a particular set of genitals and gonads, but it doesn't in this case. Or you might have one set of genes, but different genitals. Or you might have one set of gonads, but different genitals and different genes. Those are intersex individuals. There are individuals that have fully both sets of gonads sometimes, but that's quite rare. But there's a huge range of variation. And so we got to step back from thinking that the categories male and female are distinct things, right? Because if we say male, female, intersex, no overlap, right? And no one believes that. No biologist believes that. But we talk about it as if that was the thing. Yeah. Rather, I want to say, okay, what are you interested in? Gonads? Let's look at the range of variation gonads. Height, skull shape, muscle density. Let's look at that range of variation and ask some actual biological questions as opposed to be saying, I know what male and female are, shut up.
I see, yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. So one thing you mentioned in the book, it's not it's not like super long, but I thought it was really important actually, is this idea. I was a little surprised by this as well. Again, I don't know all the history about this, but this idea that this biologically distinct sexes became common in the 18th century. This hasn't been around since forever. So we've been I guess maybe some of that is, most people put, 1800 as kind of the start of modernity, blah, 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 whatever. But, okay, so in the modern era, we've seen two distinct sexes, biological sexes. How did people think about sex before the 18th century?
So this is an amazing area of that's worth a whole thing. And there's some great books on these histories. But what I want to point out is that when we're talking about this history, and when I'm talking about it in the book, I'm talking particularly about this sort of Western, sort of Eurocentric history, because there are multiple different histories around the world of different things. But the one we're thinking about in our contemporary sort of global medicine and biology sort of discourse, really through about up until the 18th century, 1800s, that area, what we saw was not a two types of sex thing, like males and females, but rather the one human with a rank ordered sex thing, that the female body was sort of a lesser version of the male body that had slightly different functions. And you can see this is, from Aristotle, from the Greeks, and even Galen, the Romans, that there's this sort of history in sort of medical and biological assessment in the Western world of thinking of a hierarchy of value within the human species. So why that's interesting is that they didn't say there's two types of human, but rather there's the sort of better type of human, the male, right? And this sort of other lesser type of human, the female, who has slightly different things. I mean, you could even see this in Darwin, right? Darwin believed that male animals were more pugnacious, more creative and intelligent than female animals, and that they each filled their roles. And so there's that history. But starting around the 18th and 19th centuries, there became a real interest because of cultural changes in this sort of binary view, the either or, male or female, as opposed to the version, the hierarchy concept. And so they began looking right away for differences. Okay, well, what makes a male and what makes a female? So of course they looked initially at genitals, but and most people sort of know this but don't admit it. If you line up millions of humans and you look at all the genitals, there isn't a clear dividing line. There is a lot of variation in human genitalia. There are standard patterns, but oh man, there's a lot of variation. And what's really important to point out is that almost all of that variation is fully functional, right? Size and shape really are not as important as, contemporary porn and public opinion makes you think they are. So I think that's really important. And I think that's really important for people's mental health to realize that there is not one normal genital. There's actually this huge range. Now, there are patterns. It's typical patterns, right? So pretty soon the researchers were like, okay, genitals aren't getting us this nice dividing line. So like, you know what? gonads. That's it. There's ovaries, there's testes. They produce, the gametes. These are totally it. We got it. We're binary. So then they developed, microscopes, and then biopsies, like to be able to look at the tissues. And they found, oh, wait, sometimes people have both, or sometimes some of the tissues aren't developed, or sometimes the same gonad has both ovary and testes tissue in it. So clearly it's not a binary. There are differences, there are patterns in biological variation, but it's not two different kinds of things. And so around that time is when they landed on, wait, no, gametes, that's it. Look, they're totally different. There's a big one and a small one. And we can also debate about it. But anyways, let's just stick with that. It's a binary. We win. We've got it. But then back to where we began this part of the conversation. What does that tell you? It tells you something, but does it tell you everything or even that much about what it means to be male or female? And I'm going to argue, no, not if you treat it exclusively in a binary fashion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I guess kind of back to the gonads. The thing I want to bring in here is hormones. So
Right.
all gonads produce the same hormones, right?
Yep.
I mean, this isn't, I don't think, controversial.
No, most people don't know this. Most
Really?
people are like, wait, what? Women have testosterone? I'm like, dude,
Really?
yes. Yeah. Just
that's
talk
wild.
to people. Most people have no idea that we all have the same hormone.
Yeah,
All
yeah.
mammals, right? Most
Yes.
other animals have very similar hormones, the same
Yes.
hormones. But it is the fluctuating levels and the receptor dynamics. There's all this sort of endocrine system stuff.
Yeah. So it's wild if people don't know that. But all gonads produce the same hormones, but
Right.
those with ovotestes have different in levels of hormones. So what's the
Right, well,
kind of difference?
those with ovaries and those with testes have differences, right? So if you have fully sort of typically functioning ovaries and typically functioning testes, you produce different amounts in different pulses, right, of these hormones. The standard hormones are, right, the androgens, but we talk about testosterone mostly. Estrogens, right, estrogen, estradiol, stuff like that, and progesterone. And there's other stuff too. There's other stuff that's produced. And it's not only the gonads, right, the testes and ovaries. Other parts of the endocrine system also produce some of these hormones.
Or the pituitary, the thyroid,
pituitary,
the
thyroid.
adrenal.
Yeah, so, yeah, exactly. So there's a whole bunch of other things going on. The endocrine system is marvelous, crazy, incredible. It's a wild system. But what's really important is that there are, especially post-puberty, some pretty significant differences in bodies with testes and bodies with ovaries in particular hormone patterns. And that's important. It's not binary. It's not like you have testosterone or you don't, but the fluctuating levels and the way in which your body, the receptors to these endocrine hormone, to the system, the way in which the body interprets the signals of testosterone or estrogen or progesterone are really important. So really just in a nutshell, we know a ton about this, but yet we don't know enough. What we do know is that infant humans, for example, undergo what's called a mini puberty right at the end of gestation and right around birth, where those infants with testes and those infants with ovaries actually experience this big fluctuation in the same hormones, but at different levels. Then that drops out a few months after, like 4 or 6 months after birth. And then between then and like right before puberty, there's not really that much difference in hormone levels in humans. Most people don't realize that.
Yeah.
Like 7-year-old boys and 7-year-old girls, this we classify, they don't have these radically different hormone levels. It's then as you gear up towards puberty, DHEA and other hormones start to kick in, and these different systems start to kick in that are related specifically to reproduction and other patterns of growth. And that's where we start to see some patterns of variation that push apart aspects of bodies and reproductive tracts and things like that. So it's super cool, but it's not binary.
Yeah. It is deeply, endocrine system is deeply fascinating and it's wild. So one of the things I really liked about the book, which I've read a few of this, books like this and read some papers and stuff. But one thing, maybe just how you wrote it or where it stands out, is we talk a lot about humans. We're very anthrocentric, which is fine. We're humans, but for me, we're not. Well, in some ways we are special. In other ways we're not special. We're another animal on the planet. We all are, prone to, or privy to evolution, just like, my house cat and the dog and, all these things. So things need to kind of, for me, have to sit within that. And we should not, in either direction, whatever your priors are, shouldn't be this special category for humans, in my view. So you do a great job of this, I think, in the book, which is you give a lot of other examples from the of other animals in the animal kingdom where we see this, and this is one of the things that, years ago when I started, kind of, being open to some of these things, I was like, well, yeah, but we're not so special. Let me hear other examples from the animal kingdom. So you talk about bees that have, one small gamete, two large gametes. You talk about earthworms, they're all intersex, they have 12 sets of sex chromosomes. Fish, sequentially, all these different things. Give us a little bit, give us an appetizer, a taste of where else we see these things in the animal kingdom.
So this is why I don't understand how any intro biology class could ever be boring. Like, this is the coolest stuff. But it's also, as a scientist who's really interested in biology writ large and humans in particular, studying other mammals and other animals in general is what we call the comparative. Like, how do we know what's us if we don't study the common systems, right? That evolution means we're all connected. And so understanding these things allows us to know what's distinct about us, right? And what's not. So I throw the whole other animal sex variation. I have a whole chapter, and I hope people get through it, just talking about like how do reproductive systems develop. And I think that's really important, because if you talk about sex, know what you're talking about, right? That stuff. But then I get to the fun stuff, which is like, how do animals do sex? And there's a lot of different ways to do sex, right? There's a lot of commonalities, but there's a lot of differences. I mean, you talked about bees. Bees are amazing, right? So bees have two forms of the large gamete producer, what we would call female, right, and one form of male. They're haplodiploids, so the two large gamete producers have two sets of chromosomes. The small gamete producers, the males, or what we call drones, only have one. The queen or a couple queens are the only ones that can, large gamete producers that can reproduce. All the other females, right, we call workers. They actually don't reproduce, although they do sometimes. So there's like multiple bodies, and that's amazing, right? Because that shows us some of the variation in this basic idea. So back to anisogamy. The fact that bees have big and small gametes doesn't mean that they don't do something totally different with that than we do, right? And so that's why I'm getting back to the gametes. Like earthworms. Okay, so earthworms, standard earthworms, really fascinating creatures. So each earthworm body has the full complement of both reproductive systems, right? Everything to produce, the whole system to produce eggs, ova, and the whole system to produce sperm. And most earthworm species can get together with other earthworms and swap like gametes, both packets, right, of the gametes, or they can just do it in their own body, right, and swap amongst themselves. And then, like you said, they have 12 sex chromosomes. There's this crazy chromosome system. That's another thing. Two gametes, a big and a small, but that doesn't tell us at all about the actual bodies and lives of these organisms. Fish. So fish are always amazing. But I think what's really interesting, and this is one of the big fight with people who are like, no, there's binary sex. I'm like, okay, many fish species start out producing either small or large gametes, and then change happens in their life. Either they grow to a big size, or social change happens, or temperature change happens, and they switch totally. Like their whole body redoes the biology to produce the other kind of gamete. And so my question here is, if the two gametes are two different kinds of things, how does one body with the same genetic code in the same life be both things at different times in its life? And that's amazing, right? And so again, the whole point of this is to show us that there are multiple ways to do sex in the animal kingdom. So when we talk about humans, we can't just say sex. It's all biology the same thing, because it's not, right? Now, there were binary gametes in every one of those examples I just gave you, right? But they didn't really tell us about the lives of these organisms. Let's take some mammals, like my favorite, spotted hyenas, right? Crocuta, are just mind-blowing. They have, what you would call a pretty standard mammalian endocrine system. They, the females produce big gametes, the males produce small gametes. But if you go out into the wild or in a zoo or whatever, and which I hope they don't keep hyenas in zoos, because they're amazing creatures and need to run around. But if you go and see them, you'll see this big one, right? Standing there, totally dominant, pushing the other ones around. And when that big one is trying to intimidate another one or make them do something, it'll get an erection, this giant erection, and has large, what looks like a scrotum, and it'll show them. That's the female.
Okay. Right.
So female hyenas have what they call pseudopenises, which is a bad name. They're actually their clitorises that have extended out and have the erectile tissue that all clitorises and penis have, but the erectile tissue, and then their vulva grows into what's called the pseudoscrotum. So it looks like what we assume is a masculinized genitals, but for hyenas, that's the feminized. That's what female hyenas look like. So again, binary gametes, but totally different lives compared, very different lives compared to us. I know I'm rambling here, but the point
it's
is,
great. That's great.
Is that this is really cool. And then we have to say, okay, there's all this variation in other animals. How does this variation manifest in humans? So to understand any given species or lineage, you got to understand their evolutionary history, their bodies, their biology. And for humans, we also have to throw in culture. So we're super complicated, but so are many other animals out there.
And the hyena thing, I remember talking to Lucy Cook, and she told me about this, and I was just like, "Oh my goodness, that's it's so incredible." I mean, perfectly honest as well. I mean, I find sexual behavior and reproduction in the wild in other animals so fascinating. I mean, I had Richard Prum on, and he was I remember in one of his earlier books, Evolution, the whole thing with ducks, and how, and like wild, absolutely wild.
Duck sex is crazy.
So crazy.
Terrifying, man.
But the thing that he found out about, and I think there was one primary researcher that was doing this with him, was that there's, how the so to speak, female duck her reproductive system has evolved to ward off some of the unwanted copulation with the male duck, because it's basically like gang rape is what it ends up being, from our standpoint, is fascinating. I mean, it's a fascinating thing. You see all of these different variations. It's fascinating.
And you got to look at it in that context, right? Yeah. And so then when you do all of that and you come back to humans, you're like, okay, all right, there's a lot of variation. There's some certain typical patterns. Where do humans fit here? How do we know that? How do we study that? How do we understand it? And I think I just want to point out, and Richard has done some great work on this too. And there's a new book out by Nathan Lentz that also does this really, really cool in a very cool fashion. And that is, I want everyone to recognize, and they already know this, but people don't think about it. Your sexuality, the way you are as a sexual being, who you're interested in, who you're attracted to, what turns you on or whatever, is not in a one-to-one correlation with what kind of genitals or gonads you have.
Yeah. Well, for sure. For sure.
But that's another non-bias. I mean, that's another one of these things. It's like, dude, if we're really interested in how stuff works, we need to lean into the complexity and recognize that, there's a lot going on, but we have a lot of data about it.
Now, before I sort of want to switch to gender and gender sex and some of these other things, but just one question here that, kind of as a potential critique here that some people might bring is, it's like, well, when you say it's a spectrum, or, in the way that you explained it earlier, some people see this in terms of number, right? So we mostly see, people, they stay on the binary and they say, what is intersex folks, is less than 1%. Non-binary people, is less than 1%. 95% of people are going to probably, fit into, again, this binary. That's how most people will see it. How could that possibly be a spectrum if we're just pointing out all these very, very, less than 1% here? Right. How do you usually engage with this kind of, critique?
So, I mean, I've been engaging with it this whole time. What you just described is not a binary, right? You say, well, 95% of people are easily classifiable by whatever category into male and female. But, right, you just use those categories. But does that mean their height is in a binary, their weight, their muscle mass, their, actually nothing about these bodies? Give me a measurement, any measurement, and I will illustrate that it's not, that it's more of a spectra distribution than it is a binary. And I think that's really important, because the second part of the title of the book is the biological limits of the binary. I'm not saying there aren't binary aspects. I'm just saying the binary frame, like, well, 95% are males or females. It actually tells you almost nothing, right? Most people want to talk about sports, or want to talk about sexual interest, or want to talk about, vocabulary ability or ability at fighting. Okay, let's talk about those things. And what you're going to find is that the pieces, the parts, biological and cultural, that we talk about are not distributed in two distinct types, but rather this very complex set of overlaps, or this spectra. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it makes sense.
And I think I don't want to let people get away with saying, well, there's two categories. I'm like, well, you just defined two categories. What are we talking about? Give me, as a scientist, you need to be able to test stuff. You need to be able to collect data and demonstrate them. And you can't just say, well, that's a male and that's a female. We're done. You actually have to demonstrate, what are we talking about and what are the patterns of interest, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, gametes are binary, but gametes are not the whole story. And they don't tell us nearly as much as most people think.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that what I'm kind of registering from your position is that that you're explaining is this idea of that one part, or focusing on one part, just as historically it was gonads or it was chromosomes, or it was, we're focused now on gametes, which may be mostly two, but you're looking not only just at one part, you're looking at all of the parts in tandem. More the gestalt of what makes a biological sex for somebody.
Exactly. And so think of it this way. Humans and all life are not machines. We have it beaten into our head that like we have this machine model of the human, right? So you can't just take out one of our parts and say, okay, here's a part, right? It turns out you can take out and we can swap organs and stuff like that, but they're always part of this sort of complex organismal system, right? It's an organic process. Mm-hmm. And so to say, well, gametes are binary, therefore males and females are binary, when almost everything else about the body is not in a true binary, but rather the spectrum or overlapping distribution or something, is to deny the real biological dynamics. And actually, it hurts us when talking about health and lives and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with you there. So gender, how do you define gender? I think this is another thing where, even for myself, I mean, I've definitely evolved on that. I mean, I think that, when as we do more research and stuff, it's like, okay, for me at this point, I find gender really hard to disentangle from culture and environment. I mean, it's so loaded with it. And so, I mean, I don't think it's a synonym for that, but I mean, it is very much, overlaid on that. So yeah, how do you define gender and how it's different from biological sex? And what's that overlap of society and environment there?
So this is the $20 million question or Nobel Prize question. Like anyone who eventually perfectly figures this out is going to do us all a great job. So when we think about gender, I just want to say to people, and I think this is really important because people always say that, oh, I've improved on it, I've evolved, or I'm better. I'm like, everyone needs to cut themselves a little slack. This is complicated stuff. You grow up with experiences, perceptions, and relations. Those shape how you see the world. That's nothing to apologize for. That's a very human thing. That changes over time sometimes, and sometimes it doesn't. That's just the way it is. So, the only thing I would suggest to people is if you're really interested in, then listen and see what's going on, because gender roles, and I'll explain what that is in a moment, and gender diversity change over time across culture, over the entire planet, as long as we've been around, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so gender in its sort of traditional sense is the sort of social, cultural, societal expectations and roles that are assigned to particular bodies. Usually, in many societies, there are two categories, male and female, right? Which the gender version is man and woman, right? So male is not a gender, right? Man is a gender, and woman, because that encompasses the bodies, the appearances, the behaviors, the social roles, the expectations. Many societies have multiple genders. That is more than two, right? 3 genders, sometimes 4 or 5 genders. Over the last few centuries, that has reduced, right? With colonialism, the expansion of the Abrahamic religions, there's been these patterns of change. That's a whole other conversation. But let us just say that gender are these social, cultural, political roles and expectations that societies place on bodies, right? And for practical purposes for this discussion, let's talk about, there's usually, at least 2 main categories, man and woman. But more usually, we're actually talking about masculine and feminine, right? We're talking about ways to be in the world. So, yeah, that's what gender is.
I think just one thing here. I mean, I've done a bit of reading on it that you can find still. I mean, to your point, I think your point about kind of the 3 major religions of the world that have spread through empire and colonialism, all these things, really has an impact, because when you look at some indigenous groups that are in certain parts of the world, you do see still today, various genders, right? Different ways of representation. I think it's example. I think in some African countries, I think it's in some South Asian countries. I think it's definitely in So one tribe or a couple tribes in maybe Paraguay in South America. There's these different examples of how there isn't just man and woman. There is, and they have different concepts and stuff, and they're less. They've been a bit more kind of sequestered off from the aspects of the Western colonialism. Which again, I'm not railing against necessarily the West and all stuff. I'm just saying we do still have that, but before kind of the spread of colonialism empire, we had more of that. Is my understanding. So.
And even within a lot of the world where that happens, also in sort of the context of many Hindu religions, right? In context of different Buddhist frameworks, there's all over the place. There's these different sort of patterns and frames, and even within Christianity, there is a historical tradition in different places. So, anyways, there's a lot more variation. But what I think, and everyone knows this, and this is one of the things that I want people to lean into, like. Everyone who has lots of friends and family, realizes that there isn't a one-to-one correlation of particular body categories, right? And femininity and masculinity, that there's this flexibility across those things. And so gender is that way. The difficult or the important thing about gender, both difficult and important, is that each society has a set of gender roles and ideologies. And if you don't conform to those, right, it becomes difficult, right? It's hard. Now, here's the really complicated thing. And really, if anyone gets anything from my book, I want them to get these two things. One is that humans are biocultural. That is, we have biology and culture, and these things are always together, right? You cannot just say, oh, well, I'm just going to talk about human biology. There is no just human biology, right? And we can go over examples about that because it's always mediated through the lived experience and all that. So when we talk about sex or gender, almost always when people talk about it, they're actually talking about what we call gender sex. That is, researchers who do a lot of this work in this area use the term gender sex because I could be talking about, some bone structure, but it's always going to be perceived and lived and actually shaped by gender roles and cultural experiences and what you eat and how you walk. And so it almost is defeating the purpose of good science to say it's either biology or it's culture, because it's always both. And gender sex is a way to do that. But it's complicated, and people are like, it's already complicated enough. Don't make it more complicated. Well, I'm sorry, man. That's where we are.
Well, we are complicated for sure. I mean, I think if any multicellular organism starts to become more complicated.
Totally. And especially one that can ask questions about itself. That's like
right. Especially when you get metacognition and abstraction from a prefrontal cortex. Yeah, of course, right. You mentioned gender sex. I think the first time I heard about this was through Sari Van Ander's work.
Yeah,
I think it's kind of been the sort of championing this and bringing this up. I mean, you could talk a little bit more about it, but how do you feel this framework or this way of explaining things helps understand that intersection of biology and experiences?
So I think it's really important. Now, in the general, use the term sex or gender, in general conversation. People use them interchangeably, and they shouldn't be, but that's the way it's going to happen. I'm not trying to change everyone's lives or how you talk, with your friends. Mm-hmm. What I do want to sort of emphasize is that if you're going to research stuff, the gender sex framework helps, right? So, for example, if you're really interested in, let's say, the impact of testosterone on aggression, right? Everyone's interested in that. Everyone loves testosterone and fighting and all this, Let's measure it in UFC fighters and do all this sort of stuff. Well, what the gender sex sort of framework allows you to do is to understand that you're not just talking about males and females or men and women. You're actually talking about a endocrine system, right? With shared hormones, with different fluctuating levels, different kind of receptors, this whole biological system that is always influenced by and placed within a given cultural context. And we know that the endocrine system, right, the system that this facilitates the hormone movement and production and all of that, is hugely responsive to social cues and environmental cues. And so you can't actually talk about testosterone function without talking about cultural, nutritional, and sort of temperature, right, context. So you can't really talk about it with the environment. And so thinking gender sex gets you out of trying to say, okay, well, this is just the biological part and this is just the cultural part, because those two things are not truly independent. Now, in science, you have to test things. And so you want to separate up as much as you can and reduce it as much as you can. But in the analysis, and when we talk about stuff publicly, when we convey scientific information to the world, we need to be careful not to pretend it's not complicated.
This feels like the conversation about genes and IQ, right? So I don't want I don't want to drag you down that conversation because I don't really care that much about it. But when I've had some of those conversations, and where I kind of land on it is like, yeah, it's both. Like, obviously, you're going to have genes, but you cannot remove genes from an interaction in an environment, in a social culture. Like, it's impossible. We don't live in a vat. We don't live in a vacuum. But people that do, I feel like sometimes they kind of get sort of ensconced in one area, which is fine. You do have to look at the parts.
No.
But they're like, yeah, environment's involved. And it's like, well, wait. Like, it's really involved. Now, I'm not on the other side of it where it's like, genes are terrible and they're evil and it's eugenics all the way down. It's like, no. I mean, there is genetic difference here. It's not all environment either.
Right.
You know, it sort of feels sort of similar to that kind of debate.
No, it's exactly it. The only thing I would change is it's genes and cognition. Because IQ is a cultural construct, and IQ is just actually a pretty bad measure, and we don't know what the hell it really measures, and it's all anyway. But so there's even that level. But no, let's take the sex example, right? There's a whole bunch of genes, right? Segments of DNA that do something that are relevant in the formation of, let's say, gonads, right? SRY, right? It's one of the testes determining factors. So if you have a Y chromosome and you have SRY, and the SRY turns on, and the SRY produces certain proteins at a certain time in development, which is typical, right? If all those things happen, then you get some development in particular tissue masses, right? In the like 6 to 10 week old embryo that start developing in certain ways. But, right, you could also have that SRY not turn on, or you could have it be translocated to another chromosome, or you could have it produce the wrong protein at the wrong time. And so I'm just saying, even at that level, right, we know there's genetics are involved in everything, but how they're involved, what their actual influence is, and what it means for the sort of full organism, that's really complicated and that's really interesting, right? Everything has genetic. My hand, like, I mean, the hand, most people don't think of the hand as a genetic thing, but of course it has a genetic basis, right? But it also has a huge cultural structure, right? How I've used my hand my whole life has shaped what the ligaments, right? What the bones are like, what my nail growth is like, all of that stuff.
I think the biggest problem with some folks that sort of, resist this or go into it kicking and screaming is we most often see things that are commonly distributed in, kind of, and I think that's what sometimes, if we had more of, if it was a little bit more evenly distributed, I think people would probably feel or would get on board with it a little more. It's like, yeah, we can obviously see it, But I think because of that, I think that's where people struggle with it a little bit. So I think, I'm guessing.
No, you're absolutely right. But I think here is, what are we actually seeing? Are we actually seeing the real biological distribution, right? So for example, everyone knows like men are taller than women, right? About like in the United States, if you look at the data, it's about 8% on average, right? Men are about 8% taller than women on average. If you took 50 individuals, I have this in the book, right? You took 50 individuals, 25 men, 25 women, or 25 male, 25 female, let's just say that. Right. We check their genitals and their genes or whatever.
We check their gamete.
We check the gamete production. Let's do it. And we take 25 of each, and then we line up all 50 according to height. You're not going to get a 50-50 split with all the females on the lower hand and all the males on the top hand. You're going to get some mix. Now, especially towards the extreme height, there'll be more males, and the extreme short, there'll probably be more females, but you'll get overlap in there. And in fact, there's like a 78% overlap in height in the United States, even a little bit more, amongst what we call the sexes, right? Male and female. So if you're just given a pile of data on height, it's almost useless for identifying sex. Now, that's not the way most people think about it, right? Most people think, well, men are on average taller than women, right? And that's actually real. Or, I also talk about the big data set on weight, right? There's a huge overlap in body size as measured by weight or even body mass index. And that is also really interesting. Now, at the same time, on average, right, those who are male have higher upper body muscle density than those who are female, even of the same sort of height and weight. So that's an interesting pattern of variation. It's not, but even that pattern is also not just genetic or not just about the body. It's also about training. It's about lifestyle. It's about what you've eaten, what
Well,
you've done your whole life. I
right,
mean, and we know
right,
that, so you can't
right.
pull that stuff apart.
I was just going to say, as you were saying this, I was like, well, what were the prenatal vitamins like? What was it like in utero? What was it like in labor? What was it like, different forms of gestation? And then, what's your environment like? How were you, what kinds of nutrients did you have when you were a child? As you came,
How did they interact with you? Did they throw you up and down? Did you play, pee-wee football or take ballet classes?
Right. So again, it's the interaction more so than just the things themselves, which I totally agree with.
And that's what's so exciting. And so the spectrum frame, right? Remember the subtitles, the biological limits of the binary. The binary takes all this stuff off the table, and it makes life much less interesting and much less scientifically rigorous or valid. And so if we're really interested in these patterns, stuff that comes up that people really care about, we need to know what are the actual data. Like you said, people don't really know the whole data. And I will go back to genitals. And I know this is it's a weird thing, but people now, when I was younger, it was a lot different. But people now with the internet, whatever, looking porn all the time and all that. What people don't understand is you're seeing a teeny slice of variation in bodies and context. And so people are getting this perception of what genitals look like, of what sexual activity is, which is really bad for porn. But do you see what I mean? And so if we don't see the entire range of biological or cultural variation, how can we make accurate assessments? And I think most people are given a very limited slice of what's going on. And therefore, they see way more difference than there actually is.
Let's shift a bit, just as a kind of end here. I want to ask about a few things that are a little bit more practical or tangible here. Sports. This is the whole thing. This is the whole thing, right? I'm gonna drag you in this a little bit. So
that's good.
There's. If I take the charitable view of how I've heard of this, right? I think I can certainly see this. Look, if somebody is identifying as a female and they want to do what everyone else does, they want to compete, they want to play in different sports. I think in principle they should be able to. I mean, they're a human being just like anybody else, of course, yeah. People have concerns, and I think maybe some of those concerns come from some intrinsic veiled hate towards the person, and some of it does not. I think a lot of it is legitimate concerns of, look, this person has a different body type from most other folks that are on the team that are female, et cetera, and there's concerns about injury or something worse and things like that, which I could I think those are, if they're in good faith, I could get that argument. How do you in the context of your book, I mean, you don't have to opine on every social issue here, but this is a thing that comes up often. It's tricky. It's tricky. What's that line to kind of walk, do you think, on these types of things?
No, that's a great thing. And the whole reason I wrote this book and I have all this buildup about biology and history and evolution, all that stuff, is so that we can have these conversations.
Right.
These are conversations that matter. This matters to people, right? This matters to people's lives. So let me say first, I wish when we talk about sports, we didn't start with elite athletes, right? Because remember, we're talking about this teeny, we're talking about like 1/1000th of a percent of humanity. Who are way up here in the very biological variation. So, for example, almost no one I know, right? None of us actually fit the biological variation that is in those top athletes of whatever sex, right? So, first of all, elite athletes are not good representatives for humanity. I'm going to come back to the elite athletes, but I want to stress this because, in most sporting events, most pickup games, most school things, most of what's going on, a 1% advantage in the 800-meter running actually doesn't make a difference. And in our daily lives, it makes no difference for the vast majority of us. Right? Sure. So let's first talk about what we're saying, right? And remember, when we come to the trans women athletes context, but we have to also think about scale, right? There are 12 trans women competitive NCAA athletes in the United States, out of 50,000 NCAA athletes or more? Yeah, 50,000 top tier NCAA athletes. So let's put that aside for 1 second. I want to come back to it because it's really important. But what we need to understand then is if we're talking about sports, some sports very specifically require particular body structure, form, size, and training. Yes. Right? And because of that, certain body types, certain incompatibilities with training regimes or BMI, size, muscle are not going to enable those people to play sports.
Right. There's a difference between rugby and tennis.
Well, yes. Well, actually, we could debate some of that.
Yeah. You could debate that, right?
So if you want to go up against some of the women's rugby teams, I will show you.
I don't want to do any of it.
So let's get into that. So the bottom line here is we have to understand what is the size variation, the muscle variation in the bodies we're talking about relative to those who are performing that sport, right?
Okay, yeah.
So that's what's really interesting. So in the case of trans individuals, right? So in the context of sports, and here, intersex and trans individuals are very different, right? Those are not the same category.
Yeah.
So one is a gender sort of switch, a frame, a particular thing that has biological impacts, and the other is a particular variation in typical biology.
Right.
Yeah, this is a lot, but I just very
no, it's good.
I think it's really good here. So, for example, which is everyone's freaking out in the NCAA, these very, very few, very brave trans athletes are competing against women. Trans women are competing against women. And in these contexts, people freak out. But the question you have to ask first, and it's complicated. I'm not saying there's an easy one-size-fits-all explanation here, but you have to ask, did this individual undergo a full sort of typical male puberty to change some of the muscular development? And even if that individual did, does that individual fall into that high range where there's not a ton of overlap with typical female development? Because there's a lot of males who go through typical, but I am not a very big guy, right? I've had many female athlete friends who could easily, outcompete me in every, not professional athletes, I'm just athlete friends who could outcompete me in a variety of things. And so we have to think about where in the range of overlap and non-overlap do these bodies fall, right? Mm-hmm. That's an important question. So that's a difficult question. We have to think about what it means for different sports, right? Might mean one thing in swimming, a different thing in tennis, another thing in rifles. Like, why do we have gender difference in rifle sports, like shooting?
It's a little weird.
Yeah, or horse riding. So there's a whole bunch of things going on. So that's one thing. The other thing going on with the Olympics and the World Athletics, which is the World Track and Field thing, is they're basing their decisions on a certain circulating level of testosterone. And the problem is that's a cultural definition. There is not a biological dividing line, right? There are typical patterns of female testosterone levels and typical patterns of male testosterone levels, but there's not even great evidence that testosterone impacts the vast majority of function in competition. Even the people who are testing this find it only a small impact in 400 and 800 meter sprint, races plus hurdles. And then I think it's pole vault and javelin throw. I forget, it's one other. Whereas testosterone fluctuation variations does not impact any of the men's categories. There's no difference, even though men can have 300% different levels, 3 times higher or lower in testosterone. So anyways, that was a long ramble to say there's not a universal rule. There is not one explanation. We need to be very careful and considerate about who's competing, what these competitions entail, what are the biological variation and cultural variation, and who are we targeting in exclusion laws and who are we targeting in inclusion laws, and how do we think that through? I will tell you right now, there's not one size that fits all for these cases.
This might sound strange, but it's just kind of top of mind. Would it make more sense with sports? And again, you could probably break this down by different sports, but to just have different criteria. So what if you had people grouped together based on muscle mass, bone density, height, weight, kind of loosely, some of these things where it was, that there would be a sort of confidence interval with that, right? Like you're going to have between here and here, sort of kind of like a weight class, but you're just kind of looking at all of the different components. So you can't say, well, this person, has more upper strength, regardless of what they, have altered or changed or, things like that. So that we can say, no. Because to your point, I think is correct. Yeah, there are females that are way more athletic, bigger than me, that would kick my ass in a lot of different sports, even though I'm a male. It's not always a kind of one-to-one like that. Would that be too complicated?
No, well, I don't think so, right? But the flip is true. The reverse is true, right? There are many men who are going to be smaller, as you just said, so competing, right? So we don't know that a trans woman athlete is going to be larger in a particular sportingly relevant context than the women. Okay. Anyway, but yeah, so I agree with you. I would love to do that. But you know what? That's not going to happen because we have strong gender roles and histories and economic realities into gendered sports. And that's a drag. I would suggest this compromise. Get rid of most gender leagues and categories pre-puberty. There's really no difference. You do not find, if you take away training, you don't find clear division between boys and girls in most sports. It depends. American football is weird just because of the thought, like it's gotten to this ridiculous level of size. So there is something about American football, which is just, there are many things about American football that are weird, right? But that's sort of, let's put that off to the side. But baseball, tennis, basketball, right? Which you would think, oh no, everyone has to be really big. Actually, look at the vast majority of basketball games. Don't look at the elite, not the NBA, not even college basketball. Yeah, or not even college basketball. Yeah. Look around. And if you want to look at the NBA, there are some, remember Spud Webb, or there are some incredible, very small men who are amazing basketball players.
Yeah. I mean, so, Steph Curry's like 6'3", and he's fantastic.
Yeah. There's all of this variation. I think we just have to be very careful. And I'm not saying men and women are the same at all.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that we need to be careful about assumptions that a man is always going to be better than a woman at sports, and that there are clear, easily measurable biological distinctions that make that true. That's not the case. What you said though, about weight classes, about size, those are the kinds of things that make difference. Remember Michael Phelps, right? The swimmer who won everything. He just was, at this far extreme of wingspan, arm span, and he had a huge advantage over everyone. They weren't like, oh, you're biologically advantaged, you're out. And he had a larger advantage.
He kind of was. Well, his torso and his arm.
No, he was but that's part of the thing. And so, but we have, gender roles are very important, right? And so there's this argument that's being deployed, being weaponized to attack an incredibly vulnerable, small population of trans individuals. And what people don't realize is the sports thing is minimal. We can do that on a case-by-case basis or figure some other stuff out. That there's almost no one doing that. But what's really having this negative impact is that there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of individuals who are targeted for hate crimes and abuse and attack. They're already incredibly vulnerable because these people are like, oh, we can't let men compete with women. Like, dude, that's not true, right? We need to really consider this. And this is absolutely, for everyone who's making a big deal about trans athletes, and there's the intersex athletes is another big issue too as well, but trans athletes in competitive, professional elite or NCAA sports, if that's really your concern, I want you to be out there protesting like mad for equal funding for women's sports.
Yeah.
From the get-go, from K through 12 into the college level, women's sports are dramatically underfunded. They're coached differently. They're, even elite women athletes are frequently coached to keep a certain amount of feminine form, expected feminine form, to not really bulk up because you have to look sort of in a particular. Anyways, sorry, I'm rambling.
No, that's good though. But
this is such a cool thing, and this is a place where the spectrum, as opposed to the binary, is absolutely necessary. Because if we're going to say males and females are always different, 100%, two different kinds of things, we're done, and we cannot have a good conversation on this.
Yeah. I do think that in tennis, you do see women's tennis making, WTA and things like that have made considerable gains in that. And I think for a lot of people, in terms of just the average fan or viewership, I mean, I'll say Serena Williams because she's still sort of kind of in the minds of people, but I mean, her matches sometimes would be way more entertaining, just visually, as a fan, than some of the 50 to 100 men. So it's just like, okay, I think people can really get it. It's like, okay, yeah,
totally.
Now you see that a little bit with like the payout and how much it's getting much. I think the U.S. Open has been doing equal for at least 3 or 4 years now.
For the elite levels, it's getting, and the WNBA is fantastic. They still are paid nothing in it, but it's a great WNBA games are great. I mean, there's a good, and women's football, women's soccer, right? Globally, it's actually, so there's all these kinds of things, but we're just at the beginning of women's professional sports. So if we want to talk about professional athletes, we can't just compare elite women and elite men because the elite women still are, a century behind in training and infrastructure and context.
Absolutely.
And this is so important because we know competing in sports, playing sports as a child are really important for health, for development, and for well-being.
100%.
And so here we are freaking out about who can and cannot play sports rather than saying, nope, let's do more sports, funding of K through 12 sports programs. Let's do community sports programs. Let's get everyone out there playing whatever game they want to play. So it's going to make our lives better. It's going to reduce our healthcare costs, and it's going to make people healthier.
Yeah. So I guess more in the political world, which is, I mean, a mess. Just real quick, I've really tried to hear the other side of this. I really, I can't, help me understand. I can't get it. I do not know what this fixation is on bathrooms. It's a weird thing to me. People spend way too much time on it. All I know is when I go to a bathroom, I'm in there, I'm doing my business, and I'm getting out. I don't care. I'm not looking at the next urinal stall, whatever. I don't care. And I think most people feel that way. I've never had concerns about my daughter going in a bathroom and what might happen. None of that's happening. I don't understand this fixation on this. Help me understand this.
Javier, man, this is one of the things. So I have a little section in the book on this because I can't anymore, right? This is just a political, harmful, hateful thing, right?
Yeah.
The bottom line is, look, all humans, based on our physiology and biology, the bodies, all humans can urinate and defecate sitting down if need be, right? Some humans can urinate standing up, right? Okay, that's what we're talking about. Much of the world does not have gender-specific bathrooms. They have places to go pee, poop, and wash your hands.
Yes.
And they don't actually spend time there. They're like, that's not that's just for that. Let's go do this. The U.S. in particular, but a lot of the world, but the U.S. in particular is really freaked out about that and has this weird sexual thing around bathrooms. I don't know what's up with that. That's gross. And anyway, the bottom line is this is a political thing to attack trans individuals who are a very vulnerable population. What we're really should be talking about is we should have good quality restrooms. If you want stalls everywhere, put stalls everywhere. I mean, women's restrooms already have stalls. And
I wouldn't care. I wouldn't say, you know what? I can't use this bathroom because there's no urinal.
Right. Yeah. So, and then, the data, there's enormous data, right? It is there's no risk statistically of trans individuals attacking people in bathrooms. There's a big risk of sometimes messed up men, a small amount, not all men, a teeny slice of men doing some weird stuff in bathrooms. But that's neither here nor there. That is not what these things are. There are 450 more now, probably 450 laws either on the books or in process across the 50 United States that are specifically geared to exclude trans individuals from bathrooms and related content. And I'm just like, if you put that much effort into sanitation, right? Now, some of the bathrooms I go into are horrible. Right? If you put that much into healthcare, education, or let's get back to sports, put all that effort and time into paying for sports so more people can get out there and play baseball and soccer and whatever, So there's a much longer conversation on this, but that's just political and it's just mean and hateful. That's not where the real debates are. There are issues around sports. There are issues around healthcare. There's societal issues around gender and how do we express ourselves and the complexities and those kinds of things. That's all true and complicated, and we need to deal with those. A law to keep someone out of a bathroom from washing their hands and taking a leak? No.
Yeah, this kind of brings us to, I guess, kind of a good place to end here is, for me, in the world, I care about life, and that whether that's unicellular, multicellular, primates, mammals, insects, humans, and for my fellow human species, I don't really. I care. But in terms of how I'm going to treat you or with human dignity, it doesn't, for me, matter to me what you want to be called, how you're dressing, how you look, how you identify, as long as I'm going to treat you like a human. And that's, for me, that's where it starts and ends. That's what's most important. So when I can hear some of these debates, and some of them are important, but things like bathrooms and things, all these other, kind of debates, I don't, I'm with you. We should put more energy and resources into other things. But I guess the final question I want to ask is, with this book, obviously there's the book to me feels like a jumping off point for a conversation starter, and it really kind of functions that way, which is great. But I'll give you the last word here on this. What are the one or two things that you want people to take away from reading this book, and how you want them to understand things about sex and gender?
Well, let me just first say I agree with you totally that like compassion and care. If we can't lead in this day and age with all of the crises, all the craziness, with compassion and care for other humans and other creatures, it's all over, right? We got to at least try. So two things, right, to take from this. I guess the first thing is, I said before, I want it to be sex is it's all biocultural, blah, blah. But let's get specific. I want people to have maybe more questions, but better informed questions about sex and gender after reading this book. Right? That's the first thing. Just because I want to see a better conversation. You have better information and you have more questions, you're more willing and interested to talk and to listen. And so I hope this makes people speak and listen to one another more. So that's the first thing. The second thing is I want people to reflect on the amazing reality of biological variation, how it spreads across different animals, how it's constrained, how it's expanded, what we know about sex, what we know about the history of our own species, what we know about bodies in contemporary humans, to sort of look at that giant amount of information and to recognize that, one, you're okay, right? Whatever it is that you're in, that's probably part of the range of variation, and that's okay. And to recognize so is the person or people you're talking to. And just that basic understanding of what is the range. Get away from normal and typical and think about what is human.
Yeah, you I couldn't have said it any better. I am greatly appreciative for you coming on. I was looking forward to it. Didn't disappoint. I greatly recommend your book, and people will follow your rest of your work you're doing. Agustín, thanks you so much for coming on the podcast. It was a true delight, and I'm wishing you all the best out there.
Thank you, Javier. I really appreciate it. It's been a fantastic conversation.
Absolutely.